Why was she lying in the dirt instead of crawling toward the helicopter? The rotors thundered overhead, pushing waves of dust across the cracked earth of Helmand Province. The rescue bird was right there, 30 meters away, close enough that the hot wind from its blades scraped across her face. But Petty Officer Sloane Merritt didn't move toward it. She lay on her back, one leg wrapped tight in a tourniquet she had applied herself. Blood soaked through the field dressing in slow, dark pulses. And still, her voice over the radio sounded calm. "Calloway, take your 3 south. Use the Dry Creek bed. Stay low." The men in her earpiece were breathing hard, running, surviving. "Merritt, are you hit?" Calloway asked. "I'm fine," she answered. She wasn't fine, but fine wasn't the point. She listened carefully as the team confirmed their extraction routes. One by one, their voices reported movement, distance, safety. She kept her eyes on the pale Afghan sky and counted each response like a quiet checklist. Only when the last man confirmed he was clear did she finally exhale. Then she set the radio down in the dirt. She was 26 years old. And the reason she was still lying, there would not make sense to anyone for 15 years. Not until a retired rear admiral named Raymond Holt opened an envelope in Virginia and learned the truth about what she had done that morning. But to understand that moment in the dust, you have to go back to Montana. Back to a gravel road outside Billings where winter winds moved across open land like a living thing. Sloane grew up in a small house at the end of that road with her father, Gunnery Sergeant Dale Merritt. He was a Marine of the quiet kind, the kind who never bragged about war but whose posture always faced the door. He taught her to shoot when she was 11. Not because he wanted her to fight. "The world doesn't always give you a choice," he told her once, resting a Remington rifle against a rusted fence post. "So if the day comes when your hands have to do something hard, they should already know how." Sloane learned quickly. By 14, she could place 3 rounds into a single hole at 300 yards. Her father never praised her. He simply moved the target another 100 yards back. Breathing mattered more than strength. Patience mattered more than speed. Control mattered more than anger. Those lessons settled into her bones long before she understood why they would matter. Then in November 2004, 2 Marines knocked on the front door. Her father had been killed in Fallujah. That night Sloane stood alone by the same fence post where she had first learned to shoot. The sky above Montana felt impossibly wide. She didn't cry. Not yet. 2 days later her mother asked for one promise. "No more guns," Carol Merritt said quietly. "Whatever you do with your life, not this." Sloane promised. And she meant it. She joined the Navy the next spring, became a corpsman, trauma medicine, saving lives instead of taking them. Her instructors noticed things quickly. Her hands never shook. Her mind narrowed perfectly around problems. She worked through emergencies with eerie calm. By 2009, she had already saved 53 lives in combat zones. She had never once fired a weapon. Then Helmand Province happened. The heat there was brutal, the kind that made metal burn your skin and turned the horizon into a mirage. Operation Khanjar was sweeping through the region, thousands of troops pushing Taliban forces out of key territory. Attached to one small SEAL reconnaissance team was Petty Officer Sloane Merritt. At first the team didn't know what to make of her. A woman medic, quiet, observant. She didn't try to prove anything. She simply checked her gear, monitored radio traffic, and watched the men around her with steady patience. Some of them doubted her. Briggs joked she'd be safer staying behind at rally points. She didn't argue. She just kept working. The first mission went smoothly, no contact. The second mission pushed deeper into narrow terrain where the team moved single file through dry riverbeds. Sloane stayed silent, keeping pace with the formation, watching every step of every man in front of her. 40 minutes into the march, one of the seals collapsed. Before anyone understood why, Sloane was already beside him. "Tension pneumothorax," she said quietly. Air was trapped in his chest cavity, compressing his lung. She pulled a needle catheter from her kit and inserted it between his ribs in one smooth motion. A hiss of escaping pressure filled the air. The man gasped as his breathing returned. 45 seconds. Problem solved. Something shifted in the team that day. Respect didn't arrive loudly. It rarely does in places like that, but the way they looked at her changed. They realized she wasn't just a medic. She was someone who saw things early. Someone who stayed calm when others didn't. Someone you wanted nearby when things went wrong. And things were about to go very wrong. Because 5 days later, in a narrow valley outside Marja, the team walked straight into an ambush designed by someone who already knew exactly where they would be. And in the middle of that chaos, Sloane Merritt would make a decision no training manual had ever prepared her for. A decision that would save a man's life, but cost her something no one would understand for 15 years. Because the truth about that valley was far darker than a firefight. Someone had betrayed them, and Sloane was about to step into the middle of a chain of events that had begun long before she ever arrived in Afghanistan. The first rocket hit just after sunrise. It came screaming out of the eastern valley, slamming into rock 20 meters from the team's position. The blast showered them with stone fragments and dust. Before the echo finished bouncing across the canyon walls, machine gun fire erupted from 2 ridges above. A perfect L-shaped ambush. They had been expected. Sloane moved instantly, dropping beside the nearest man to check injuries. Training took over, hands moving, eyes scanning. Briggs had a bleeding arm, tape, pressure. Henderson had shrapnel in his shoulder, painful but survivable. Then she saw Holt. Commander Raymond Holt, the observer attached to the SEAL team, lay on his back with one hand clamped against his inner thigh. Blood poured through his fingers. Femoral artery. Without a tourniquet, he had minutes. She slid beside him, tightening the strap high on his leg, twisting until the bleeding slowed. Gunfire cracked above them, dirt kicked near her shoulder. But she never stopped working. "Stay with me," she told him. He nodded, pale but conscious. And in that moment she noticed something else. The machine gun firing from the valley wall below had a narrow gap in the structure protecting it. A gap barely wider than a helmet. From most positions on the ridge, the gunner was safe. Except one. A flat shelf of rock slightly east of where Sloane knelt. From that angle, the shot was possible. But there was a problem. To reach that rock shelf, she needed to move quickly. And her leg was trapped beneath shattered stone from the blast. Pinned tight enough that freeing it would take several minutes. Minutes Holt did not have. Her father's voice surfaced in her mind. Sometimes the right path runs straight through the worst cost. She applied a second tourniquet to her own leg. Then she pulled a surgical blade from her kit. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, she had both hands free. She crawled onto the rock shelf, lifted the Barrett sniper rifle, found the target through the scope. 760 meters. Wind shifting left. She took one breath, pressed the trigger. The machine gun went silent, and the team survived. But no one on that ridge truly understood what she had just done. Not yet. Because some sacrifices are too large for the mind to accept all at once. The medevac helicopter arrived later that morning. Sloane watched it lift Holt into the sky before she finally allowed herself to sit down in the dirt. Only then did she look at her hands. Both of them were steady, exactly the way her father had taught her. Years later, long after the war had faded into quiet headlines and forgotten reports, Raymond Holt opened the envelope that revealed the truth. Inside was Sloane's medical record, and a line written by the admitting physician that had been erased from the official report. Self-inflicted surgical amputation to free both hands and continue life-saving treatment. Holt read the words twice. Then he sat very still at his kitchen table, because suddenly the memory of a woman kneeling beside him in the dirt, one hand on his wound, the other lifting a rifle, finally made sense. The system had hidden her story, but the truth had waited patiently. And truths like that always find their way home. Sloane Merritt never spoke about that morning. She returned to Montana, opened a small medical clinic, walked on a prosthetic leg that creaked softly on wooden floors. Most people who met her never knew what she had done. They only noticed she had very steady hands. And sometimes, when the clinic closed in the evening, she would step outside and watch the sky over the empty plains, just like she once had beside a rusted fence post. Because some lessons travel with you forever. Lessons about courage, about sacrifice, about the quiet weight of promises, and about the strange mathematics of war, where sometimes the cost of saving one life cannot be measured in numbers at all. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it doesn't even explain itself. It simply acts. How could someone still be giving orders after losing that much blood? The helicopter was already lifting off when the realization began spreading across the ridge. Dust spiraled into the sky. The valley echoed with the fatting thunder of the rotors. The SEAL team stood scattered among broken rock, adrenaline slowly draining from their bodies. And then Briggs looked down. He followed the trail of blood. It stretched across the dirt where Sloane Merritt had crawled. Too much blood. Far too much. "Where's the medic?" someone asked over the radio. No one answered, because for a moment, none of them had actually looked at her. They had been focused on survival, on getting Commander Holt into the helicopter, on clearing the valley before the enemy regrouped. But now the valley had gone quiet, and Sloane Merritt was sitting against a rock 30 feet away. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't asking for help. She was simply tightening the strap of her tourniquet again. Her face was pale beneath the dust. Sweat ran down her temples, but her breathing was slow, measured, controlled. Briggs walked toward her slowly. "What happened?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her kit and calmly began sealing the wound she had created. The silence felt wrong. Finally, Briggs noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Her right leg ended above the knee. Just ended. For a long moment, the battlefield seemed to tilt sideways. He started. Then he stopped, because he suddenly understood something that no one else had yet processed. The machine gun nest. The angle. The shot. The only place on that ridge where a clear line of sight had existed was the rock shelf Sloane had crawled onto. The same shelf surrounded by shattered stone from the rocket impact. Stone that had pinned her leg beneath it. His voice dropped. "You cut it." Sloane looked up at him quietly. Her eyes held the same calm focus she always carried during emergencies. "Yes." Just one word. No drama. No explanation. Briggs stared at her, trying to process the scale of what she had done. "You cut your own leg off." She shrugged slightly, wincing as the motion pulled against the wound. "I freed my hands." The words landed softly between them, but the meaning behind them carried enormous weight. The rest of the team had gathered now. No one spoke. In combat, soldiers witness brutal things: injuries, loss, fear. But something about this felt different, because this wasn't chaos. This had been a decision. a deliberate act performed with cold precision, while bullets were flying overhead. Sloane finished wrapping the dressing around the stump and leaned back against the rock. Her vision blurred slightly. Blood loss was catching up. Still, she kept her voice steady. "Radio command," she said. Briggs hesitated. "You need a vac." She shook her head slowly. "They already have the helicopter." "You're bleeding out." "I'm stable for now." The truth was more complicated. She had performed the amputation quickly, cleanly, but it had been a battlefield procedure, temporary. Without surgical care soon, infection would take hold. But Sloane understood something the others hadn't realized yet. The ambush wasn't random. It had been too precise. Too perfectly timed. Someone had known their route. And that meant something worse than gunfire was moving through the operation. A leak. She closed her eyes briefly, fighting the dizziness. Then she reached for the radio. "This is Merritt," she said quietly into the transmitter. There was a pause. Then a voice answered from command. "Merritt where, Holt?" "Evac Bird has him." "Status of the team?" "Alive." Another pause. Then the voice asked something strange. "Is the observer conscious?" Sloane's eyes opened slowly. That question didn't make sense. If the helicopter had already left, command would know his condition through the flight medic. So why ask? She looked toward the sky where the helicopter had disappeared. Then she understood something that made her chest tighten. The person asking that question did not know the helicopter had already arrived, which meant they were not actually watching the operation feed, which meant the voice on the radio might not be command at all. She kept her tone calm. "Observer is stable." The voice responded quickly. "Confirm location of extraction point." Another strange request. The team's extraction point was classified. Command already had it. Sloane felt a quiet ripple of suspicion move through her mind. Someone was fishing for information. Someone who shouldn't have access to this radio channel. She lowered the transmitter slightly and looked at Briggs. "Did you hear that?" Briggs nodded slowly. "Yeah. Something's wrong." The wind moved softly through the canyon. No gunfire. No movement. Just the distant hum of insects returning after the battle. But beneath that quiet, a darker realization began forming. The ambush hadn't been just about killing the team. Someone had wanted Commander Holt. Specifically him. Sloane's eyes drifted back to the radio. She lifted it again. "Command, repeat authentication code." The channel went silent. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Then the signal cut completely. The team exchanged glances. "That's not good," Briggs muttered. Sloane exhaled slowly. "No," she said quietly. "It is." Because now another possibility had entered the situation. If someone inside the system had leaked their mission, then the Valley ambush might only be the first move. And Commander Holt, now alone on a helicopter flying toward base, might be flying straight into the second. Sloane tried to push herself up. Pain slammed through her body instantly. The world spun sideways. Briggs caught her before she collapsed. "Easy," he said. "You're done for today." But Sloane shook her head weakly. "No." Her voice was barely more than a whisper now. "They're not done." Briggs looked confused. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the sky again. "The helicopter. What about it?" Sloane swallowed, forcing her thoughts through the growing fog of blood loss. That radio call wasn't command. Silence spread across the ridge. Then Henderson spoke slowly. "You're saying someone Inside our network set us up. Sloan nodded faintly. And now they're trying to find Holt. Briggs stared at the empty sky. Why? Sloane's eyes closed for a moment. She didn't have that answer yet. But she had a feeling about it. A quiet instinct that had saved lives before. Because Holt knows something. What? Her voice dropped softer. I don't think even he knows yet. The wind shifted again through the canyon. Far away, thunder rolled faintly over the mountains. Storm clouds were forming on the horizon. And somewhere beneath those clouds, a helicopter carrying Commander Raymond Holt was flying toward a base where someone might already be waiting for him. Someone who had planned the ambush. Someone who had nearly wiped out an entire SEAL team. Someone who had underestimated one quiet medic with steady hands. Sloan Merritt drifted in and out of consciousness as the second helicopter finally arrived 2 hours later. The last thing she remembered before the stretcher lifted her into the air was Briggs leaning beside her. His voice was quieter now. Different. You saved all of us, he said. She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because in her mind she was still replaying the strange voice on the radio. Still hearing the question, is the observer conscious? There had been something in the tone. Something careful. Something deliberate. And as darkness slowly closed around her vision, one thought continued echoing softly in the back of her mind. Someone inside the system had wanted Commander Holt dead. And the real battle had only just begun. Why would a decorated commander suddenly disappear from every official record? That question didn't appear immediately. At first, everything looked normal. The hospital lights were bright, too bright. Sloan Merritt felt them even before her eyes opened. The sterile smell of antiseptic floated through the air. Machines beeped quietly somewhere beside her bed. For a moment, she thought she was still in the helicopter. Then the pain arrived. It was sharp, deep, and impossible to ignore. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She tried to move her right leg. Nothing moved. Her eyes opened slowly. The ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar, a hospital ceiling, somewhere far from the dust of Helmand Province. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. The memories returned in fragments. The ambush, the rock shelf, the rifle, the blade. Her gaze drifted down the bed. The blanket lay flat where her leg should have continued. Instead, it ended in a carefully wrapped surgical stump. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Not in shock, not even in sadness. Just acknowledgement. The world had changed. A quiet knock came from the door. A Navy surgeon stepped inside, Lieutenant Commander Ellis, mid-40s, tired eyes. You're awake, he said gently. Sloan nodded slightly. How long? 3 days. Her throat was dry, talking felt like sandpaper. The team. Alive. She closed her eyes briefly, letting that information settle. Good. Ellis pulled a chair closer to the bed. You performed the initial amputation yourself, he said carefully. She nodded. I had to free my hands. The doctor studied her for a moment, not judging, just trying to understand. Most people would have panicked. I didn't have time. Another quiet moment passed. Then Sloan asked the question that had been sitting in her mind since the valley. Commander Holt. Ellis hesitated. He survived. Relief washed through her chest. But the hesitation in the doctor's voice lingered. Something else happened, she said. It wasn't a question. Ellis leaned back slightly, choosing his words. The helicopter carrying Holt diverted from the base. Why? That's complicated. Sloan waited. She had learned long ago that silence often pulled the truth out of people faster than questions. Finally, Ellis sighed. Officially, Holt was transferred to another facility for observation. Officially, the word hung between them. Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly. And unofficially, Ellis looked toward the door, as if making sure no one else was listening. The helicopter changed course halfway to the base. To where? An intelligence station outside Kandahar. Sloane felt a faint chill run through her body. Why would an observer be taken there? Ellis shook his head. No one is explaining anything. The room went quiet again. Sloane turned her head slightly toward the window beside the bed. Sunlight spilled across the floor. Her mind replayed the strange voice from the radio. Is the observer conscious? Not the team. Not the medic. The observer. Holt. Something about him mattered, she said quietly. Ellis nodded. Apparently. Another silence followed. Then Sloane asked something else. Have you seen him? The doctor hesitated again. No. He hasn't visited. No. That answer surprised her more than she expected. Not because she wanted recognition, but because soldiers understood debts. And the man whose life she had saved had vanished completely. Not a message. Not a report. Nothing. Almost as if he had been erased. Ellis stood slowly. You need rest, he said. Your body lost a lot of blood. The prosthetic fitting will begin once the wound heals. Sloane nodded. The doctor moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else. She looked at him. Your official report, he said carefully, states your leg was lost due to blast injuries from the rocket strike. Sloane blinked slowly. That's not accurate. No. Why change it? Ellis exhaled quietly. Because the alternative raises questions no one wants to answer. What questions? Why a Navy medic had to perform an emergency amputation during a mission that supposedly had full air support and operational security. In other words, the report was hiding the mistake. Or perhaps the betrayal. Sloane stared at the ceiling again. The truth was being buried. The ambush. The radio call. The helicopter diversion. All of it quietly smoothed into a version that looked clean on paper. But war rarely leaves clean edges. Ellis opened the door. One more thing, he said. She waited. Someone from Naval Intelligence asked about you this morning. Her eyes shifted back to him. What did they want? They asked about your radio transmission after the ambush. Her pulse slowed slightly. They're reviewing recordings. Did you tell them anything? I told them you were unconscious. That earned the faintest hint of a smile from Sloane. Thank you. Ellis nodded and left the room. The door closed softly behind him. For several minutes Sloane lay quietly, listening to the soft rhythm of the heart monitor. Her mind returned again to the moment on the ridge. The voice on the radio. The question. And the strange urgency behind it. Someone had been searching for Holt before the helicopter even arrived. Which meant the leak had been watching the operation live. Watching and waiting. She turned her head slowly toward the empty chair beside the bed. Something about this situation didn't fit. Commander Holt was not a high-value intelligence officer. He was an operational observer. His role was simple: evaluate field coordination between units. Nothing about that job justified an ambush. Nothing about that job justified diverting a helicopter to an intelligence station. Unless Holt had seen something. Something important enough that someone inside the system wanted to silence him before he could report it. But what? Sloane closed her eyes again, replaying the battle step by step. The valley, the machine gun, the rocket strike. Then suddenly, another memory surfaced. A small detail she had ignored at the time. Just before the ambush began, Holt had been studying a satellite tablet. Coordinates. She remembered him frowning at it. Something off, he had muttered quietly. She hadn't asked what he meant. The rockets arrived seconds later. Now that moment echoed louder in her mind. Something's off. Maybe Holt had noticed something in the mission data. Something that shouldn't have been there. A location. A movement. A pattern. Something that exposed whoever had leaked the operation. And if that was true, then whoever had planned the ambush would be terrified of one thing. Holt remembering what he saw. Sloane opened her eyes slowly. Because if the enemy couldn't kill Holt in the valley, they might try somewhere quieter, somewhere easier, somewhere like a secure intelligence station where accidents could happen quietly and reports could be rewritten just as easily as her medical file. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. But her thoughts had already moved far beyond the hospital room. Because somewhere in Kandahar, a man she had saved was now sitting inside a facility where he might be in more danger than he had been in the middle of a Taliban ambush. And the one person who understood that danger best was lying in a hospital bed missing a leg. Sloane stared at the ceiling again. Her body was weak, her future uncertain. But one quiet thought kept rising above the pain. The battle in the valley had ended. The real fight had not. Why would a woman who had just survived war suddenly try to leave the hospital before she could even stand? The nurse noticed it first. It was subtle. A small shift in routine. Petty Officer Sloane Merritt had been a quiet patient for the past week. She followed instructions, took medication, sat through the early prosthetic consultations without complaint. Most recovering soldiers either talked too much or refused to talk at all. Sloane did neither. She simply listened. But on the 8th morning something changed. The nurse entered the room and found Sloane sitting upright in bed, already dressed in loose physical therapy clothing. Her hospital gown was folded neatly on the chair. "You're up early," the nurse said gently. Sloane nodded. "What time is physical therapy?" "Not for another 3 hours." Sloane glanced toward the window. Sunlight was still soft outside, the early morning quiet that existed before the base fully woke up. "I'd like to walk today," she said. The nurse hesitated. "That might be a little soon." Sloane didn't argue. She simply looked down at the prosthetic limb resting beside the bed. It was still unfamiliar. Lightweight carbon fiber, metal joints, a tool more than a body part. But her expression held something stronger than curiosity. Determination. The nurse noticed the look immediately. "You're worried about something," she said. Sloane's eyes lifted slowly. "Maybe. Want to talk about it?" For a moment Sloane considered it. But the problem was complicated. It wasn't just about the ambush anymore. 3 days earlier, she had overheard something in the hallway outside her room. 2 intelligence officers speaking quietly. They thought the door was closed. They were wrong. "Transfer him tonight. The report still isn't complete. If he remembers those coordinates, it becomes a problem." Sloane had remained perfectly still in bed, pretending to sleep. But every word had burned into her mind. Holt had seen something, and someone was nervous about it. The nurse placed a cup of water beside her bed. "You should focus on recovery," she said kindly. Sloane accepted the water. But her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Because if Holt truly was in danger, time mattered. And the longer she stayed inside this hospital room, the less control she had over what happened next. "Help me with the prosthetic," Sloane said quietly. The nurse studied her again. "You're not cleared yet." "I know. You could fall." Sloane gave a small shrug. "Then I'll fall." The nurse sighed. Sometimes she recognized a look in certain soldiers, a look that meant arguing would accomplish nothing. It was the same expression that sent people running into danger when everyone else ran away. She helped attach the prosthetic. The first step was awkward. Sloane gripped the rail beside the bed, shifting her weight carefully. Her muscles trembled slightly. The absence of her real leg created a strange imbalance. But she adjusted. Step. Pause. Step. The pain wasn't unbearable. It was simply new. Her father used to say something about pain. It isn't the enemy, panic is. She took another slow step across the room. By the time the nurse realized what was happening, Sloane had already reached the door. "Where are you going?" "Walking. Outside." Sloane gave a faint smile. "Eventually." But her real destination wasn't the courtyard. It was the administrative wing of the base hospital. Specifically, the communications office. Because if she could access the radio logs from the day of the ambush, she might confirm something that had been nagging at her ever since that strange voice appeared on the channel. Someone had known too much. The hallway outside her room was quiet. Medical staff moved slowly through the corridors, early shift routines beginning. Most of them barely noticed the young medic carefully learning to walk again. But Sloane noticed something else. Two men standing near the elevator. Not doctors. Not nurses. Plain clothes. Military posture. Watching the hallway. She lowered her gaze slightly and continued walking. Their conversation stopped as she approached. One of them glanced at her prosthetic, then back to his partner. The look they exchanged lasted only half a second. But Sloane understood it instantly. They weren't here for patients. They were here for someone specific. Possibly her. She kept walking. The elevator dinged softly. One of the men stepped inside. The other remained outside, pretending to check his phone. Sloane reached the end of the corridor and turned into a stairwell. Her heart rate increased slightly, because now something felt clearer. The intelligence officers weren't just monitoring Holt. They were monitoring her, which meant one of two things. Either they believed she knew something, or they were worried she might figure it out. She moved slowly down the stairs, gripping the rail for balance. The prosthetic clicked softly against the concrete steps. Each step forced her body to relearn movement. But her mind remained sharp. Focused. The communications office sat on the first floor. A small room filled with radio equipment and archived transmissions from active operations. Normally access required clearance. But Sloane had been a field medic long enough to understand something about military systems. Most of them depended on routine, and routine created blind spots. When she reached the door, a young communications specialist sat behind the desk scrolling through maintenance reports. He looked up. "Oh hey, you're not supposed to be." "I need a favor," Sloane said quietly. He blinked. "What kind of favor?" "Radio logs from Operation Conjar, 7 days ago." The specialist frowned. "That's restricted. Not to a team medic." He hesitated. Technically, she wasn't wrong. Combat medics often reviewed mission recordings for medical evaluations. Still, something felt unusual. "You should request that through command." Sloane leaned slightly against the desk. "Command already knows I was there." The specialist studied her prosthetic for a moment, then sighed. "Fine, but if anyone asks, I never saw you." He turned to the console and began searching the archives. Several recordings appeared on the screen. Timestamps, call signs, encrypted channels. Sloane leaned closer. "Play the transmission at 6:07. The recording crackled softly through the speakers. Gunfire in the background. Then her own voice giving instructions to the team. Everything sounded normal, until the unknown voice appeared. "Is the observer conscious?" The room went still. The communications specialist frowned. "That's weird." Sloane looked at him. "What do you mean?" "That voice isn't command." "How can you tell?" He tapped a key, bringing up the authentication code attached to the signal. "Because whoever transmitted that message used an outdated encryption tag." Sloane felt her stomach tighten slightly. "Outdated?" "Yeah, like 5 years outdated." He scrolled further down the log. Then his expression changed. "What?" He turned the monitor toward her. "The signal didn't come from command headquarters." "Where did it come from?" The specialist pointed at the coordinates displayed on the screen. Sloane read them slowly. And suddenly, the entire room felt colder. Because those coordinates weren't in Afghanistan. They were coming from a secure communications hub. Inside the United States. Inside a naval intelligence building in Virginia. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the specialist whispered quietly, "That can't be right." But Sloane already understood what it meant. The ambush hadn't just been a battlefield betrayal. Someone much higher in the system had been involved. Someone close enough to naval intelligence to access restricted communication channels. Someone who had been monitoring the mission in real time. And someone who had been desperate to know whether Commander Holt was still alive. Sloane stepped back slowly from the screen. Her mind was racing now. Because if the leak came from Virginia, then Holt's diversion to the intelligence station in Kandahar suddenly made much more sense. Someone was trying to contain the problem. Quietly, before the wrong person started asking questions. The communications specialist looked at her nervously. "What do we do with this?" Sloane turned toward the door. Her voice was calm again. "We don't do anything." "Why not?" She paused. "Because whoever sent that transmission might still be listening." Outside the office, the hallway felt different now. Heavier, more dangerous. The two plainclothes officers were still near the elevator. And this time, both of them were watching her. Sloane adjusted her balance on the prosthetic. Pain pulsed through her leg. But her expression remained steady. Because the truth was finally becoming clear. The ambush. The strange radio call. Holt's disappearance. All of it pointed toward a betrayal that stretched far beyond the battlefield. And if someone inside naval intelligence was responsible, then the quiet medic who had survived the valley might have just become a very inconvenient witness. Why were two intelligence officers suddenly following a wounded medic who could barely walk? Sloane Merritt noticed them before they noticed her noticing them. That was something her father had always drilled into her. Awareness wasn't about starring. It was about feeling when something didn't belong. The hallway outside the communications office looked the same as it had minutes earlier. Nurses pushing carts, orderlies moving equipment, the quiet routine of a military hospital. But the two plainclothes officers near the elevator had shifted positions. Slightly closer now. Watching her more carefully. Sloane kept her pace slow, steady. The prosthetic leg clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached. Each step still required concentration, balance, patience. But her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. The coordinates she had seen on the screen were still burning in her thoughts. Virginia, a naval intelligence building. Someone there had been listening to the mission in real time. And someone there had asked a very specific question. Is the observer conscious? Not the team. Not the medic. The observer. Commander Raymond Holt. That meant Holt wasn't just a random attachment to the SEAL team. He had been important to someone. Important enough to arrange an ambush. Important enough to monitor the outcome personally. And now, important enough that 2 intelligence officers were quietly watching the only witness who might start asking the wrong questions. Sloan reached the elevator. The taller officer spoke first. Petty Officer Merritt. His voice was calm, professional. She turned slowly. Yes. The man stepped forward slightly. Mid-30s, clean haircut, controlled posture. Mind if we talk? Sloane's expression stayed neutral. About what? Your mission in Helmand. That answer was expected. Still, she gave a small nod. Sure. The second officer pressed the elevator button. The doors slid open with a soft chime. Inside the small metal box, the air felt heavier. The taller officer spoke again. You recovered quickly. Still working on it, Sloan replied. His eyes dropped briefly to the prosthetic. That must have been difficult. She didn't answer. Some comments didn't deserve energy. The elevator hummed as it began descending. Then the second officer spoke. We're reviewing the ambush. Good idea. We noticed something unusual in the radio recordings. Sloan tilted her head slightly. Which part? The unidentified transmission. For a fraction of a second, the elevator felt very quiet. Sloan met his eyes calmly. What about it? We're trying to determine how that signal reached your channel. That was interesting. Because according to the communications specialist, they already knew. Which meant these men were testing her. Probing to see how much she had discovered. Sloan leaned slightly against the elevator wall. I assumed command sent it. The taller officer watched her carefully. Did you? Her tone stayed calm. That's what the voice claimed. And you didn't question it. I was busy stopping people from bleeding out. That answer landed exactly where she intended it. Professional. Logical. Harmless. The elevator doors opened. They stepped into a quieter corridor, used mostly by administrative staff. The taller officer gestured toward a small interview room. Just a few questions. Sloan entered the room slowly and sat down. The chair was uncomfortable, hard metal. The 2 officers remained standing for a moment before sitting across from her. The second officer opened a folder. Tell us about Commander Holt. Sloan shrugged slightly. He was an observer. You didn't know him before the mission. No. How did he behave during the operation? Professional. The officer flipped a page. Did he mention anything unusual before the ambush? That question mattered. Sloan knew it immediately. They were looking for one specific detail. The moment Holt had studied the coordinates on his tablet. Something's off. She kept her face neutral. Unusual how? Anything that stood out. She paused, pretending to think. Just the usual pre-mission tension. The taller officer leaned forward slightly. Nothing about the satellite data. There it was. They were fishing. Which meant Holt really had seen something. And whoever these men worked for was nervous about what he might remember. Sloan crossed her arms slowly. I'm a medic, she said. I pay attention to injuries, not coordinates. The two officers exchanged a glance. A quiet one. But Sloane caught it. Something about her answer had unsettled them. Finally, the taller officer closed the folder. "Thank you for your cooperation." Sloane stood carefully. Pain pulsed through her leg again, but she kept her posture steady. As she reached the door, the second officer spoke one last time. "If you remember anything unusual, you should report it." Sloane nodded politely. "I will." She stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind her. And for the first time since leaving the communications office, she allowed herself to breathe normally again. Because the conversation had confirmed something important. The intelligence officers were not investigating the ambush. They were managing it, controlling the narrative, and making sure the wrong information never surfaced. Which meant the real danger was no longer in Afghanistan. It was inside the system itself. Sloane walked slowly back toward the hospital wing. Her prosthetic clicked softly with each step. The pain was sharper now. Her body was still healing. But her mind was clearer than it had been since the valley. Because now she understood something about Commander Holt. He wasn't just an observer. He had accidentally discovered something. Something hidden inside the mission data. Something that connected an ambush in Afghanistan to a communications hub in Virginia. And someone powerful enough to manipulate intelligence channels was now trying to bury that discovery before it could spread. When Sloane reached her hospital room, she closed the door quietly behind her. For a long moment she simply stood there, thinking. Then she moved toward the small locker beside her bed and opened it. Inside were the personal items returned from the battlefield. Her medical kit, her uniform, and one small tablet device recovered from the valley. Commander Holt's tablet. It had been placed with her belongings by mistake. Or maybe by chance. Sloane picked it up carefully. The screen flickered to life. Most of the data was encrypted. But the mission map still loaded. Coordinates, terrain scans, satellite overlays. She zoomed slowly toward the valley where the ambush had happened. And then she saw it. A small blinking marker that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't Taliban territory. It wasn't a SEAL movement pattern. It was a supply route. One that had been classified. But the route didn't move weapons into Afghanistan. It moved them out. Toward the border. Toward private transport aircraft. Her heart slowed slightly. Because now the pattern made sense. Someone inside the system had been using military missions to hide illegal arms transfers. And Holt had noticed the coordinates. Which meant the ambush wasn't meant to destroy the SEAL team. It was meant to eliminate the one man who had accidentally seen the truth. Sloane stared at the blinking marker for a long time. Then she quietly powered the tablet off. Because now she understood something even more dangerous. If those intelligence officers discovered she had this device, she wouldn't just be a witness. She would be evidence. And in situations like this, evidence had a habit of disappearing. The evening sun slipped slowly across the hospital floor. Sloane sat on the edge of her bed, the prosthetic leg resting quietly beneath her. Her future looked very different now than it had a week ago. But deep inside her chest, the same quiet determination still lived. The one her father had built years ago beside a fence post in Montana. Sometimes the hardest battles didn't happen on a battlefield. Sometimes they happened in quiet rooms, where the truth was something powerful people were desperate to hide. Why would a retired admiral sit alone at his kitchen table, staring at a name he should have recognized years ago? The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. Commander Raymond Holt had been retired for nearly 15 years. The Navy had faded into memory, replaced by a slower life in a small coastal town in Virginia. His days were simple now: coffee on the porch, long walks near the water, the occasional visit from former colleagues who still called him "sir" out of habit. The envelope looked ordinary. No official seal. No return address. Just his name written in careful black ink. He almost threw it away with the rest of the mail. Almost. Something about the weight of the paper inside made him pause. He carried it into the kitchen, sat down, and opened it slowly. A single file folder slid onto the table. At the top of the first page was a name he hadn't heard spoken in over a decade. Petty Officer Sloan Merritt. For a moment Holt simply stared at the letters. The memory came back in flashes. Dust. Gunfire. A woman kneeling beside him in the dirt, tightening a tourniquet while the valley exploded around them. He remembered her calm voice more clearly than anything else. "Stay with me." He had tried to thank her later, but later never came. After the helicopter diverted to the intelligence station in Kandahar, everything had changed. The debriefings were immediate and relentless. Questions about the mission data, about the satellite tablet, about the coordinates he had noticed seconds before the ambush began. "Something's off." He had said those words out loud. He remembered that now. And the moment he said them, the rockets arrived. The investigators never explained why the helicopter diverted. They never explained why he was held at the intelligence station for 4 days before being allowed to return to the United States. They simply told him the situation had been handled. The ambush had been the work of insurgents. The mission file had been corrected. The matter was closed. Closed so tightly that even Sloan Merritt's name disappeared from the conversation entirely. Holt had assumed she survived. He never actually knew. Until now. He turned the page slowly. Medical reports. After-action summaries. Most of it looked familiar. But halfway through the folder his eyes stopped. There was a line in the surgeon's report. A line that had been struck through with a heavy black mark. Someone had tried to hide it. But whoever sent the folder had restored the original text beneath it. Holt leaned closer. And read the sentence. Subject performed self-inflicted surgical amputation to free both hands and continue life-saving treatment. The room went completely silent. For a long time Holt didn't move. His mind replayed the valley again. The machine gun nest. The shot that saved the team. The medic who had crawled onto the rock shelf. He had assumed the rocket blast had taken her leg. That was the story in the official report. But this line told a different story. A much heavier one. She hadn't lost her leg to the explosion. She had cut it off herself. So she could free her hands. So she could save his life. Holt leaned back slowly in his chair. His hands trembled slightly now. Not from age. From realization. 15 years. 15 years, he had lived with the belief that the battlefield had simply been cruel. But the truth had been much more deliberate. And much more human. He turned the next page. More documents appeared. Radio logs. Mission maps. And finally, a photograph. It showed a small medical clinic in Montana. Outside the building stood a woman with dark hair tied back loosely, leaning slightly against the doorframe. A prosthetic leg visible beneath her jeans. She looked older now, but the eyes were unmistakable. Calm. Steady. The same eyes that had looked down at him while the valley burned. Holt stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he noticed the final page in the folder. A typed note. Only one sentence. You deserve to know the truth. No signature. No explanation. But Holt understood who must have sent it. Someone inside the system who had finally grown tired of carrying the weight of that lie. He folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. For several minutes, he sat quietly at the kitchen table, thinking, remembering. Then he stood. His knees protested slightly as he reached for his coat. 15 years was a long time to carry a debt. Too long. The flight from Virginia to Montana took nearly a full day. By the time Holt reached the small town outside Billings, the sun was already sinking toward the mountains. The clinic looked exactly like the photograph. Simple, quiet. A wooden sign above the door read, Merritt Family Medical. Holt stepped inside slowly. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. A few patients sat reading magazines. Behind the reception desk, a nurse looked up. "Can I help you?" Holt nodded. "I'm looking for Sloane Merritt." The nurse smiled slightly. "She's finishing with a patient." He sat down and waited. 10 minutes later, the door at the end of the hallway opened. Sloane stepped out. Her prosthetic leg moved smoothly now, practiced after years of use. She didn't notice him immediately. She was reading a patient chart, focused. Then she looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Recognition arrived slowly. Her eyes widened slightly. "Commander Holt." He nodded. "Petty Officer Merritt." The waiting room had gone very quiet. Holt stepped closer. For years, he had imagined this conversation. But now that the moment was here, the words felt smaller than the truth behind them. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Sloane tilted her head slightly. "Know what?" He held up the envelope. "About the valley." Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Understanding passed through her eyes. "Oh," she said softly. For a moment, Holt struggled to find the right words. "You cut off your leg," he said finally. She shrugged gently. "I freed my hands." The same words she had spoken on the ridge. Simple, uncomplicated, as if the decision had been nothing more than practical. Holt felt something tighten in his chest. "You saved my life." Sloane looked at him calmly. "You were bleeding out." "That's not the point." She studied him for a moment. Then she gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Maybe it is." Silence settled between them again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt complete. Finally, Holt nodded toward the exam rooms behind her. "You built something good here." "I try. People know what you did." She shook her head. "Most of them don't need to." Holt looked around the small clinic. Patients waiting quietly. A nurse organizing charts. A place built entirely around helping people heal. Then he looked back at Sloane, the woman who had once made an impossible decision in the middle of a battlefield. "You never told anyone," he said. Sloane's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where the Montana sky stretched wide and endless. Then she looked back at him. "Some things don't need an audience." Holt nodded slowly. He understood that now. War often celebrated loud heroes. But the real strength he had seen in that valley had been quiet. Unannounced. Unrecorded. The kind of courage that acted before anyone had time to notice. He turned to leave. At the door he paused. "There's one thing I still don't understand." Sloane raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Why you never asked for recognition." She thought about the question for a moment. Then she answered softly. "Because the men walked off that ridge alive." She paused, and that was enough. Holt stood there quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded and stepped outside into the evening light. Behind him, the clinic door closed softly. Inside, Sloane Merritt returned to her patients. The same steady hands, the same quiet focus. Most people who met her would never know what she had done in a distant Afghan valley. They would only know that she listened carefully and helped them heal. But somewhere in the world, a man carried the truth of her sacrifice. And sometimes that is how dignity survives. Not in medals, not in headlines, but in the quiet memory of a life that chose to act when action mattered most. Because sometimes courage doesn't speak. Sometimes it doesn't even explain itself. It simply does what must be done and walks forward.